Remember these words, rebasing, middle-income economy. These are a few words that you might be hearing more and more over the coming few days as Kenya now shifts to a new GDP data set. And in studio, I'm now joined by Nicholas Malaki and Kenneth Kaniu from Stanley and Pine Ridge Investments, just to help us get through what this actually means to Kenya. If we'll start with you, Nicholas, rebasing, middle-income status. These are words that have been bandied around by government, treasury, everyone who's been in the know. What does it exactly mean for Kenya?
Thanks, Karanja. Rebasing is not a very complex word. It's like going back to zero, having a new starting point from where you are going to begin to count the value in the economy. So in the current circumstance, we are using a base of 2001, but as Treasury say, we need to move to more recent numbers, and that is 2009, and hopefully that will capture the reality in terms of the real value of the economy from where it's began from.
Yeah, can we talk about real value of the economy perhaps? What are some of those sectors that were left out and that now Treasury sees that actually can compute and can be computed and make Kenya's economy even much larger than it is currently?
No, what tends to happen is that, as Nicholas has ably explained, you find that changes in price in the economy, changes from the point of view of the structure, introduction of new goods and services, innovation, those types of things tend not to be captured if you don't rebase the economy frequently. And I think the average, they say, is every 5 years. I think that's what the IMF and World Bank tell us. Most countries, what they tend to do is that they don't account for changes in inflation. So they tend to use a GDP deflator to account for inflation and to ensure that you don't have distortions in terms of the aggregate size of the economy. Yeah. But what tends to happen is that tends to overstate the traditional dominant sectors in the economy, such as agriculture, and it tends to understate the new sectors that are coming through, such as telcos. So you end up with a scenario where your traditional sectors appear to have a very large size, your new ones obviously are understated. You end up with a scenario where, from a geographic perspective, some cities and towns may be overstated from the point of view of output, and so on and so forth. So it's healthy practice to actually to do that sort of thing.
And just looking at industries that you probably mentioned, telecommunications has become huge over the last few years. Real estate is somewhere where we've been saying there's a boom, that there might be a bust. Then you look at other sectors such as financial services. When you include all this, how big do you think the economy can grow by?
I think the estimate is that GDP should expand by at least 20 to 25%. If you look at the experience of our neighbors in East Africa, the increase has not been as large. Tanzania moved to a base year of 2002. After about 5 years, the GDP only expanded by 10%. If you look at Uganda, they also moved to a base year in around 2002, again only a 10% expansion. If you look at the example of Ethiopia, they moved to a base year of 2011, and in fact GDP was flat, it didn't go anywhere. But you only have to look at countries like Ghana and Nigeria, where when they did rebase, the GDP expanded by more than sort of 50% in Ghana and 80% in Nigeria. But that was because they had not rebased in such a long time. I think in the Nigerian example, it was more than 24 years. If you look at the Kenyan example, I think we're talking of maybe 8 or 9 years, so it's not as large. So we don't expect a very significant jump. But I think, as we mentioned earlier, we're not doing it for purposes of the jump. We're doing it, as was explained earlier, to capture the reality within the economy and make sure that the data set we're looking at is current. We need it obviously as investment managers, we need that as policy analysts to figure out exactly where the value is being created and to obviously make good forecasts going forward.
But Nicholas, if I was to come to you, there's been this fear that this might just be something that is glossy for policymakers and that it will give them confidence over certain things and how they now view policy decisions down the line. Is that the case, and what exactly now does this rebasing the economy help them do going forward?
Yeah, rebasing in principle is a tool mainly for policymakers and the analysts. It's not something which will go down to be understood by the normal mwananchi as such. What policymakers want to find out is what is the sector distribution, what is the size of the economy, what is the structure of the economy, where do we need to put more emphasis to be able to move towards achieving, the Vision 2030, for example. And what rebasing does is gives you that new base in terms of the reality on the ground as it is. because we are using sector estimates which were there probably in 2001. But the dynamics of the economy have changed. You've talked about financial services. Things like mobile money transfer is actually a big issue in the economy now. Yeah. But in 2001, that was not as big. But when restated, in current terms, then its contribution to the overall development of financial services as a sector can actually be better captured. But as I say, this is mainly for policymakers. Hopefully, they can be able to understand where we are more and be able to put in the policies to fight unemployment and poverty, which is not going to be fought by just the rebasing. I mean, the rebasing just gives them the policy ability in terms of new data to be able to structure their policy decisions as well.
One thing I'm guessing Treasury is looking after is the change in that debt to GDP ratios, where I'm guessing is going to come down and allow them to borrow more. Is that something that is going to be good, or are we still over-borrowing as a nation?
Yeah, and I think the facade around all this rebasing, and the timing of it, of course, would want to make some people think otherwise. Because what ideally it means is that you have got a bigger GDP base, and we borrow as a proportion of GDP. So that means in absolute terms, if your base, the GDP grows, then even that small percentage or the same percentage you maintain for debts, in absolute terms, can actually be an increase in debts. So hopefully this can allow us to assess maybe what are the new debt sustainability levels in the current economic setup, as opposed to if we looked at the economy in 2011. Yes, and this is just having a new place to start calculating GDP. It does not mean that there is growth, and I think that is a misconception that is there. It doesn't mean that the economy has actually grown. It just means there's a new base, there's a new starting point. It's a new 0 point for us to start from.
Right. And what about access to credit? Are we going to get it at the same rates, or are we going to get it at much higher rates now that we consider ourselves slightly larger than we were 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. I think now that we've been classified as a middle-income country, then the sort of rates that we would access from the Bretton Woods institution, from a borrowing perspective, are set to increase. So in terms of access to concessional loans, concessional funding, grants, you may now begin to access these things slightly closer to market rates, which obviously from the point of view of the country changes the way that it is viewed and positioned in the world. But again, if you look at also a lot of these ratios that are computed as a function of GDP, some will be positive for the country and obviously some will be not. I'll give you an example. If you look at savings as a function of GDP, we are now going to look worse off. We are already amongst the lowest savers in the region. We are nowhere near our Vision 2030 target. So that just means we need to be more productive from a savings perspective. If you look at, for example, levels of financial markets development or capital markets measured as relative to GDP, again, we're going to look worse off. So there are winners and losers from a ratio perspective. But we tend to feel that from the point of view of, I think some of the winners, of course, they are winners, obviously on this side. If you look at people like portfolio investors, people who are interested in investing in our equities markets, our debt markets, for a lot of them, they like lower levels of indebtedness. So they will be happy with this kind of rebasing. But again, as was being explained earlier, if you look at the other side and you look at the ordinary mwananchi, what does this mean for him? I'm not sure it means a lot. What we're telling him is that per head he's supposed to have more money in his pocket. But I think it really speaks to income inequality, because obviously this is not wealth that is being distributed. It's not wealth that you can touch and see. And again, if you do look at levels of unemployment, levels of poverty, those are the things on the ground that need to be tackled, as opposed to talking about the fact that everybody now has $1,000 in their pocket and so on and so forth.
Right. But just to add on to that, the rebasing is not going to change the facts about our economy. Unemployment will still be where it is. Probably poverty is where still it is. But we have a policy tool which we can be able to use.
Direct.
Yes. The increase in the national output does not necessarily mean that individual incomes, for example, have increased. Yeah,
because I'm checking and I'm seeing average income is likely to grow from about $999 USD to about 1,246 USD. But I guess that's not reality for everyone.
Yes. I mean, we're talking about the output in the overall economy, which has increased. But as I said, that does not in mean that your individual income has also increased. Probably your individual income is still probably the same. And that's the reality that we need to address, and not create illusions that rebasing necessarily translates into an immediate gain for households and individuals.
So do you call it a mirage?
Yes and no. Yes and no, because on the one hand is good. In fact, the UN Statistical Commission recommends that economies be rebased probably every 5 years, because it helps policy makers come up with policies that are current and not based on old data. So on the one hand, it is quite positive. On the other hand, you want to say is that let it not create illusions in the minds of Kenyans that suddenly we are a middle income country and we start talking large that Kenya is a middle income country compared to our brothers probably in West Africa.
Right. What does this then do for economic blueprint Vision 2030? Because other sectors, I'm guessing, by the very nature, we've more or less hit our 2030 goal of being a middle income nation. But then again, I'm looking, and then there's things like lower middle, and higher middle income countries. Because I'm guessing things like education, health have not been fully addressed. So how then does this now direct how we view Vision 2030?
I don't think it changes too much, because if we do look at the Vision 2030, I think now they're in the second phase of their medium-term plan, and the first phase was not fully achieved. It was not fully achieved from the point of view of productivity in the economy. We still tend to be very consumption-led, because unfortunately for Kenya, growth means more imports, not actually exports. If you look at a lot of the major projects that were planned, a lot of them are only now gaining traction in the second phase of the medium-term plan, not in the first one. If you do look at productivity as measured by growth in GDP, we're not yet at the 10% level that we're chasing. So really, from the point of view of Vision 2030, what happens is that this gives them, as policy analysts and tools, a right data set to be able to compute growth going forward and to be able to obviously execute on these sorts of projects. I think for them it is positive, because if you look at a lot of the projects that are planned, they are capital intensive and they're infrastructure focused. So for them, obviously, as a government, they have sat down and determined that they would rather borrow for these projects rather than fund them through internal sources. So the rebasing of the economy for them is positive from that perspective, because from the point of view of absolute terms, they can get more money into the economy and channel them towards these projects. I think what it does is it points out the fact that more work needs to be done. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at some of these ratios, like GDP as a function of or savings as a function of GDP and so on and so forth, we are still way behind. And again, these are all targets that have been documented from the point of view of Vision 2030 in terms of where it is we want to take the economy. So I think it gives them a better focus and also gives them a better set of data to work with. But does it get us closer to our goal of Vision 2030? Not completely convinced.
All right. Now, Nicholas, if I was just to ask you, African nations seem to be on this bandwagon of rebasing. We started off with Nigeria, and Nigeria base became the largest economy in Africa, hitting about $488 billion in terms of GDP. Why is it that it looks like African economies are actually now coming back to this idea that was muted by the United Nations in terms of actually recalculating your economy so often?
I mean, to me, if we want to develop policy, we need the most current data. But it's a very tedious process to do to go through this, and hence the recommendation by UN Statistical Commission for 5 years. But in reality, most of these countries are doing it after 10, 15 particular years. But the beauty of it is that it also gives you a feel-good factor, in terms of now we are big, and that appeals especially to investors who suddenly realize, hey, there are certain sectors in the economy which are actually growing and which we actually can find opportunities to be there. So apart from just, the normal saying, we want to have the current data, is a feel-good factor and also a tool that could actually be quite progressive in terms of attracting investment in particular sectors which had not been captured. There's no data in terms of how their growth, but suddenly they are there and people can see this sector is there, it's real, it is growing, and hence an opportunity for us to be able to take advantage of opportunities in that particular sector.
For Nigeria, it looked like things like Nollywood, oil, just level of areas that needed investment in Nigeria looked huge. In Kenya, apart from financial services and perhaps real estate, what other sectors perhaps do you think investors would be keen to actually inject new cash?
I think just before that, one of the sectors that we feel is not adequately captured is the unpaid labor in the rural areas. It is there, it's producing towards the economy, but how do you then bring it to the economy? And that's when you come and say, probably we are understating the output actually, particularly in this economy. Yeah. But having said that, I mean, I think if in Kenya, entertainment is not as big as probably would have been in Nigeria. In Kenya, probably most of it would revolve around financial services and intermediation, including things as, chamas and these all investment groups there, which they are contributing to a certain form of capital mobilization intermediation, but you're not bringing them into the basket and how to measure what is the actual contribution in terms of developing the economy. Probably maybe...
just coming to you, Ken, how do we try and then capture the informal sector? Because there's a lot of money out there, and that can be seen from the way government has been very aggressive in terms of ensuring people start up their own businesses and are able to come onto some form of data capturing mechanisms where Treasury can be able to track them. But now if you go to certain areas, let's say even in the Jua Kali, you can't compute what these guys are making, but there seems to be real money down there at those levels, even cheap labor where you just get someone does odd jobs here and there, but there's actually some contribution. So how then do we capture that informal sector?
It's fairly difficult to capture, but the government has already started taking some steps to ensure that they try to adequately capture this information on the ground. I think the first step obviously is devolution, which is very positive. You're decentralizing services back to the ground, which means, for example, if you're an informal trader, there's now a requirement even at your local ward level to register your business. So at the very basic level, we get to know that you have registered a business. You're well aware now that from an NSSF perspective, they are now trying to capture as much contributions from anybody. So in fact, I think the law now is that if you have even just 1 or 2 employees, you must register them for NSSF. If you look from a tax perspective, the Kenya Revenue Authority is trying to widen the tax net as much as possible, because rather than taxing more out of Karanja and Nicholas, we'd rather actually get the informal sector into the wider sort of tax net. So there are a couple of initiatives that the government is trying to undertake to ensure that they capture the flows from this from the informal segment, because I think as we've noted here, you may find that the informal part of the economy could actually be even rival the formal part of the economy from the point of view of productivity, from the point of view of flows, from the point of view of revenue, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, all of that is monies which are intact. And what we're trying to tell the government is that we need you to run on twin engines. We have no problem with you borrowing, obviously within certain parameters, but there is much more revenue to be captured from the economy from a tax perspective than they obviously would imagine. And I think just going back to what you were asking earlier, the World Bank Chief Economist for Africa is a guy called Shanta, and he famously remarked in 2012 about the African tragedy of statistics. The numbers are simply not available, they are unreliable, they are not updated, and in fact it is estimated by the World Bank that Africa's overall GDP is probably understated by up to 1/3. So you can imagine what that means for policy, for analysts, for investment. It simply means that we are looking at the wrong data set. So you do find that in as much as the rule is 5 years, it's an expensive undertaking. In our example, the Bureau of Statistics had to send out enumerators on the ground to actually capture this particular data. So it's an expensive exercise, but it's something that needs to be undertaken in its own right, because there's a lot of value that is attached to that sort of thing.
Is it a case of African governments afraid of sharing data or even collecting it? Because it paints for them a picture that perhaps won't be rosy for them.
Numbers can be good out there, but the reality on the ground probably maybe is different from what you're seeing in the numbers. So you see all these growth figures, you say now the economy is up by another 20%, but I don't feel it. But I feel it when, like Ken says, there's someone who has got a greenhouse and they produce tomatoes and onions and go to South Bay in the evening and sell them from their boot. How do you capture them? Now, if you tell them demand has increased in the economy, they can easily be able to tell. So again, I say, yes, statistics are there. People need statistics. Policymakers need statistics. Investors need statistics. Economists need statistics. For example, we are now on the last day of September. Q2 GDP numbers are just coming in. You'd have expected probably to get this data in July. Exactly. So data tends to be slow in collecting, and that's what I think we are trying to achieve at this particular point, just to improve on the readability, on the usability and current data, which is good for making decisions as of now, evidence-based decision making, as opposed to relying on past data.
Kenneth, was just to ask you, currently Kenya is on that whole referendum push and whatnot. Now, we're telling Kenyans that Kenya's economy is now bigger. Then how now, can this be used by people to agitate for actually government to increase or better the way living conditions for Kenyans?
Well, I'm not a political analyst. I'm not going to wade in the waters of the referendum.
Yeah.
But I think the government is going to have a challenge. I think anybody in government is going to have a challenge explaining what these numbers actually mean to the person on the ground, because it's very possible to misinterpret these numbers. You know, someone will feel on one hand that the economy has expanded. Why am I not feeling it? Somebody will begin to postulate, fine, the economy has expanded, but the money must have gone somewhere. The money must have gone to somebody.
So
the money
pressure on government now even increases.
The money must be in somebody's pocket, which of course is the wrong mentality.
Yeah. Or let's have more of it.
Or let's have more of it. You know, why have you not been doing this more frequently? So what we'd want to see happen is more money being spent on basic services and basic infrastructure. So more money being spent on roads, more money being spent on hospitals, healthcare, education, to allow the rural person, to allow this person who is trapped in this 40% poverty number that we keep hearing about, to be able to have the means to pull himself out of poverty. If you're able to give people that sort of access, then you'll see more people being able to pull themselves out of poverty and more into the productive part of our economy, more into the middle class, and so on and so forth. I think that really that is what is required at the end of the ground, or at the end of the day on the ground. We keep hearing about the so-called trickle-down economics, which at the end of the day tends not to trickle down because you simply don't have the channels to actually reach the person on the ground. But if you were to sort out the infrastructure on the ground, you can allow this person to pull himself up. But that is a message that I know will be fairly difficult for government to explain to the ordinary person. And when you combine the business of government and politics, then the message just gets completely lost.
Any thoughts on the same?
Yes, I mean, I actually feel the same, because you are just putting more pressure. Suddenly we are bigger, but we are not feeling it. What should be done for us to feel it? And there'll be calls, for more probably allocations and like that. I think the biggest challenge for me coming out of the Nzambas is not just having the opportunity to increase debt as a proportion of GDP, but trying to also increase revenue as a percentage of GDP, because that also is another aspect that you need to look at it. So on the one hand, yes, you've got an opportunity to increase debt, but let's also try and increase revenue as a percent of GDP to go beyond the 14% you have, and probably you have maybe a 40 or 50% revenue as a percent of GDP.
Then how does rebasing just influence the kind of investment decisions going forward for government?
Certainly there are sectors which will come out, which probably had not been captured. And probably those are new sectors for policy makers to start looking at. And there are those sectors which probably have been thought to be bigger than they are. Then you suddenly realize we have actually been focusing
on the wrong areas.
On the wrong areas. Our priority sectors should actually be these. But I think most importantly, what as my colleague said here, is the soft sectors, the social sectors. They may not necessarily come in the numbers, but those are the sectors that you need to address for the normal person to be able to feel the goodness. But I would say I'm proud today, Kenyan, because we are much bigger than probably we were yesterday. But that doesn't mean that we have grown. Yes.
What do you think the investment cycle going forward will be?
I think it'll be positive. I think, as we mentioned earlier, I think for many investors, they look at these numbers with a lot of joy. I think from the point of view of, as I said earlier, the equity sort of investors, fixed income investors, they'll be much happier. I think from the point of view of investment into infrastructure and so on and so forth, that will continue unabated, because obviously now you can borrow more. So I think a bit of positivity is attached to that. And just like Nicola said, I'm also quite happy and quite proud to see what's happening. I think they now say we'll be is it the fourth or fifth largest?
Probably fourth
largest economy in Africa. But we have to add a note of caution here, because it's fourth largest, but it's not a very strong sort of fourth largest. If you do look at many provinces in South Africa, you look at maybe one or two cities in Nigeria,
that are much larger.
They are larger than the aggregate economy of Kenya. So we still have some work to do. But I think it's definitely a positive sign. We're using the right data set, and I think from the point of view of investment flows, you should see this looked upon more from a positive perspective, rather than negative perspective.
Then just in closing, then what happens to these new sectors? Because I think government, when they get that there are new sectors that they can get squeeze out money out of, they seem to now introduce tax and other measures, just keeps killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So now what happens to those sectors? And then what happens to our traditional strong sectors like agriculture, tourism, and let's say manufacturing? How do you then review them?
I think what we want to see from government, other than simply taxing these sectors, is more incentives. We need to see more of a nurturing environment for these sectors to actually grow. So we need to see, for example, more bilateral partnerships with other governments. We need to see the implementation of double tax agreements to allow, obviously, our economies to grow and work in partnership with other economies. I think those are the sorts of initiatives that we'd want to see from government, as opposed to purely taxing these particular sectors. I think we've seen that in some sectors, increased levels of tax do not work.
Yeah.
If you do look, for example, at the beverage sector, you look at what is happening, for example, with EABL. The high levels of tax on some of its products are simply, are simply killing it. If you look at what's happening from the point of view of the tobacco sector, the high levels of tax are really beginning to hinder growth now, and we are hoping now that is a message that government can begin to understand. Obviously, we are not here advocating for people to drink more, but obviously what we are advocating for is for government to provide more of that environment to allow businesses to thrive. So better policy, better legislation, and so on and so forth, as opposed to simply just levying more taxes.
Right. Then, just gentlemen, in closing, your final thoughts. What do you expect out of today's announcement that's going to be made?
I expect more positivity. I expect more.
What percentage do you see us growing by?
I'd give it 20%. Fifth.
Nicholas?
Growth probably 20-25%, but the structure definitely of the economy has changed in terms of being dependent on certain sectors, and as initially thought, I think that could change as well.
All right, gentlemen, it has been a pleasure, and thank you for sharing more information about what rebasing actually means for Kenya. That has been Nicholas Malaki and Ken Kaniu from financial analysts, just painting a picture of what rebasing means for this economy and where we are headed in terms of joining that league of middle income countries.